This is an online map of global marine traffic. Look at it. Dozens of tankers are sitting off the coast of the United States, except they're empty. There isn't a single barrel of oil inside them. And you know what's strangest of all? The U.S. is the world's largest oil producer. The country pumps around 13.5 million barrels of oil every day, roughly 10% of total global production. At the same time, its oil reserves hold more than 800 million barrels of crude. The infrastructure's there, the pipelines are there, and yet those tankers off the coast are still sitting empty. And here's another strange detail. Despite producing such enormous volumes of oil, the U.S. is still importing millions of barrels of crude from abroad right now. So why doesn't the country just fill those empty tankers with its own oil and make a fortune? Let's find out. First, let's look at where the U.S. actually produces its oil. The country's main oil tap is the Permian Basin, a vast area stretching across western Texas and southeastern New Mexico. A huge share of America's crude comes from this region. Large volumes are also produced in North Dakota. Now let's look at where that oil can actually be loaded onto tankers. The country's main export gateways and largest refineries are concentrated along the Gulf Coast, in ports such as Houston, Corpus Christi, and Beaumont. So what's the problem? Problem is that thousands of miles separate the oil fields from the loading terminals. But what about pipelines? These steel arteries are already operating at the limits of their capacity. Imagine a wide highway completely jammed during rush hour. That's basically what oil transportation in the U.S. looks like during periods of peak production. Most pipelines in the U.S. are built around strict take-or-pay contracts. This means that large companies reserve the right to move a certain volume of oil through the pipeline years in advance. If a pipeline is already packed with these contracts, a new or smaller producer simply can't push its oil into the system, even if it already has a buyer and a tanker waiting at the port. There's just no spare capacity, and building a new pipeline takes years and billions of dollars. On top of that, pipelines aren't universal. You can't simply send different grades of crude through the same pipe at the same time without a complex separation system. This creates a kind of infrastructure bottleneck. The physical oil exists, but its path to the dock is blocked by legal and technical limits. The economics also work against exports. The cost of moving oil from shale fields to Gulf Coast ports ranges from about $2 to $5 per barrel. In a market with fierce competition and unstable prices, that amount can make all the difference. If the price difference between selling the oil at the port and selling it near the field is smaller than the transport cost, that oil will stay in the pipeline or in local storage. For the producer, it's often more profitable to sell it at a discount to a nearby refinery than to pay to move it all the way to an empty tanker. But then why not use trucks or trains? The answer's simple. It's inefficient. A typical tanker truck carries only about 200 barrels, and that means replacing even a modest pipeline would require thousands of trucks moving along public roads every single day. This would not only create horrific traffic and wear down road surfaces much faster, but also burn massive amounts of expensive diesel, pushing transportation costs through the roof. Rail transport looks more serious, but oil companies run into the same hard limits of profitability and technical complexity almost immediately. Building huge oil trains requires thousands of specialized tank cars. They're expensive, require specific maintenance, and are often in short supply. On top of that, oil trains have to share the tracks with passenger trains, grain shipments, and coal trains, which makes delivery schedules highly unstable and dependent on the overall load of the rail network. But you know what else is a problem? Even if the oil somehow reaches the coast, that still doesn't always mean tankers can be filled efficiently. When we talk about global oil exports, we're talking about giants. The most efficient vessels for transporting crude are VLCC supertankers. Each of these ships is enormous. They can be up to about 200 feet wide and 1,080 feet long, and most importantly, they can carry around 2 million barrels of oil. These are basically floating islands, and they're what keep long-distance shipping costs low. But the U.S. has a serious technical problem. Its ports are too shallow to use these giants properly. For a fully loaded VLCC supertanker to safely berth, the water ideally needs to be around 79 feet deep. Unfortunately, the vast majority of ports along the Gulf Coast are only about 43 to 49 feet deep. If you fully loaded a ship like that right at the port, it would simply run aground. And that creates an absurd situation. You have a massive ship and tons of oil, but you can't connect the two at the shoreline. In the U.S., there's only one exception, the Louisiana Offshore Oil Port, or LOOP. It's the only terminal in the country capable of receiving and fully loading a VLCC, and it's not located on shore, but about 18 miles off the coast in the open sea. It's a complex and expensive engineering system, and it can't handle all of America's exports. Its design capacity is around 1.2 million barrels per day, while its actual throughput is roughly 65,000 to 450,000 barrels per day. And yes, most of that volume is imports, not exports. So in the end, the one port that can properly handle these tankers turns out to be of limited use. The other ports have to rely on workarounds that slow the whole process down and make it more expensive. To get around the shallow water problem, ports use so-called ship-to-ship transfer operations. The process works like this. A giant tanker anchors far out at sea where the water is deep enough, then smaller shuttle tankers begin moving back and forth to it. They pick up oil from the port, carry it out to the giant vessel, and transfer the cargo from one ship to another. It's a complex and risky operation that requires perfect weather and extreme precision. And this process is not only slow, but also expensive. This method adds another 2 to 4 days to the loading time of a single supertanker. On top of that, the use of smaller vessels and the extra transfer operations add between 50 cents and $1 to the cost of every barrel. When you're dealing with millions of barrels, those are enormous losses. As a result, many tankers either leave underloaded or avoid U.S. waters altogether, choosing instead the deeper ports of the Middle East, where loading can be completed in just a few hours without any extra intermediaries. But couldn't the U.S. simply use its existing export ports and smaller vessels? Well, technically yes, but there's a problem there too. To move the same amount of oil that fits into one VLCC supertanker, you need 3 or 4 smaller ships. In narrow and winding waterways such as the Houston Ship Channel, this turns into a logistical nightmare. These channels often allow only one-way traffic for large tankers and are highly vulnerable to fog and storms. Multiplying the number of voyages several times over puts fatal pressure on traffic control services and port infrastructure, leading to days of delays that the shipper ultimately has to compensate for. And the existing oil ports themselves simply cannot handle that kind of load. For example, Corpus Christi currently handles about 2.2 to 2.5 million barrels per day, and that's essentially its practical limit. To reach production volumes of more than 13 million barrels per day, the entire network of coastal pipelines would have to be rebuilt, and of course, billions of dollars would have to be invested in additional infrastructure. On top of that, the harsh economics of maritime shipping come into play, where size has a huge impact on the final price of each barrel. Chartering 3 smaller tankers will always be significantly more expensive than hiring one giant vessel, not to mention fuel costs, port fees, and the wages of 3 separate crews. When American oil competes in Asian markets with crude from Saudi Arabia or the UAE, where supertankers are loaded at deep water terminals in a matter of hours, every extra logistics cost makes U.S. exports less attractive. Okay, let's say all those transportation and logistics problems were somehow solved. There's still the problem of the oil itself. Many people think oil is just a black liquid that's basically the same everywhere, but that's not true. The oil produced from American shale fields is classified as light sweet crude. It's light and contains very little sulfur. It's high-quality crude that can easily be turned into gasoline. But here comes the paradox. American refineries are not especially fond of this oil. The reason is that the most complex U.S. refineries were built decades ago. Back then, the United States was importing huge volumes of dirty, heavy crude from Venezuela, Mexico, and Canada. Refineries were specifically designed to process this heavy, high-sulfur feedstock. They have a high Nelson Complexity Index, which means they can turn even low-quality crude into high-quality fuel. But processing light crude in these facilities is still not as profitable. As a result, a strange situation emerges. The U.S. is forced to export its own light crude to Europe and Asia because there's simply not enough domestic refining capacity designed to process it in such volumes. At the same time, America continues to import heavy crude for its refineries, creating opposite flows of tankers. Ships carrying light oil leave the U.S., while ships carrying heavy oil arrive in the U.S. On top of that, this chemical mismatch means that even if millions of tons of unused light crude are sitting in storage, they can't help fill a tanker that needs heavy crude for a specific refinery. And this is where another complicating factor comes into play. There's one legal document that interferes with the normal movement of oil inside the United States. It's the Jones Act, passed back in 1920. Its basic idea is simple. Any maritime transport of goods between two American ports must be carried out only on vessels that meet three criteria. The ship must be built in the United States, owned by U.S. citizens, and crewed entirely by Americans. The goal of the law was noble, to support domestic shipbuilding and the American merchant fleet. But in fact, it has isolated the U.S. market. The problem is that building a tanker in the United States costs several times more than building one in South Korea or China. American sailors' wages are also far above global standards. As a result, operating a Jones Act-compliant vessel is incredibly expensive. Because of this law, empty foreign tankers that could otherwise carry oil between American ports are forced to sit idle or sail overseas. Legally, they can't load cargo in Houston and unload it in New York. This creates a logistical imbalance. One coast has a surplus of oil and empty foreign ships, while the other has a shortage of oil and not enough American vessels. Millions of tons of oil are left unused simply because transporting them cheaply is essentially forbidden. And this is where we should come back to the infrastructure problem. Why isn't the United States trying harder to improve it? The Jones Act would still create difficulties, but the overall efficiency of America's oil trade could still be increased dramatically. In fact, the country's trying to head that way, but it's a very difficult process. There are projects for terminals such as SPOT, the Seaport Oil Terminal in Texas, developed by Enterprise Products. It's designed as a modern hub that would allow huge VLCC tankers to dock and load directly without the need for smaller intermediary vessels. This could speed up exports several times over and significantly reduce costs. However, this is where environmental and bureaucratic factors come into play. For years, the government and the courts have been blocking the construction of facilities like this. Environmental groups file endless lawsuits arguing that construction would cause irreversible damage to the ecosystem, increase the risk of oil spills, and contribute to higher carbon dioxide emissions. Every construction permit has to pass through dozens of agencies and can be challenged for decades. One of the clearest examples of this kind of administrative standoff was the long-running saga of the Keystone XL pipeline. The project, which was supposed to become a major artery for moving crude oil to refineries on the Gulf Coast, turned into a symbol of political ping-pong. Over the course of a decade, it went through a series of presidential bans, court reversals, and renewed approvals until it was finally buried in 2021, leaving investors with billions of dollars in losses. The story of the Dakota Access Pipeline is just as telling. Unlike many other projects, this one was actually completed and brought online, but the legal battles around it have continued even while it's operating. For years, environmental groups have been trying to shut down the flow of oil through the courts, demanding more and more environmental impact reviews. A situation where already operating infrastructure worth billions of dollars can be shut down by a district judge creates the atmosphere of an investment thriller. There is another project, a gas project to be fair, but it shows the broader picture, the Constitution Pipeline in the northeastern United States. Its construction was blocked not by federal law, but by a death-by-a-thousand-cut strategy at the state level. For years, local authorities refused to issue a single permit needed to cross waterways. As a result, a project that was badly needed to connect producing regions with consumers was simply abandoned because there was no way to predict when the bureaucratic hurdles would ever be cleared. As a result, investors often walk away from their plans, unwilling to pour billions into projects that a court can freeze at any moment. The United States is left with yesterday's infrastructure, a system built for imports, not for large-scale exports. So the oil keeps piling up on shore while tankers continue to sit empty because the modern gateways they need were never built. This is a classic example of a clash between economic ambition and environmental policy where logistical efficiency ends up losing. And this is where it's worth mentioning that the United States has a massive oil stockpile, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. These are millions of barrels hidden in giant salt caverns in Texas and Louisiana. At first glance, if tankers are sitting empty, why not just take oil from there? Well, there are several reasons. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve is not a commercial warehouse. It's more like an emergency go-bag for an energy apocalypse. Under U.S. law, specifically the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, the president can tap these reserves only in the event of a severe energy supply interruption. First, using government reserves simply to help private companies make money on exports or fill empty ships would legally amount to the misuse of a strategic resource. It'd be like eating all the emergency food in your bunker just because you don't feel like going to the store. Second, there's a conflict within the pipeline network. The main pipelines that run from the storage sites to coastal terminals are the same pipes that carry fresh crude from the Permian Basin. In Texas and Louisiana, infrastructure often operates at 90 to 95% of its capacity. If the government decided to export millions of barrels from the reserve, that oil would literally have to push aside commercial flows, and since private companies have long-term pipeline transportation contracts, oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve would simply have no available space in the system to reach the port. On top of that, the salt domes where the oil is stored are fragile geological structures. The physics of storage works in such a way that frequent injection and withdrawal of oil can cause the cavern walls to deform or deteriorate. Using the reserve constantly to regulate the market wears down the infrastructure. And finally, it's important to look at the current balance. Right now, the United States is in a phase of replenishing the reserve, not drawing it down. After 180 million barrels were released in 2022 to stabilize prices, the level of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve fell to lows not seen in 40 years. These days, the U.S. Department of Energy is slowly buying oil back, bit by bit, to rebuild this shield of national security. Knowing this, selling oil just to fill random tankers would be complete nonsense. There's one more important nuance that's often overlooked. Not all the oil physically stored in facilities on U.S. territory actually belongs to Americans. Some of these storage spaces are leased by foreign governments and international traders. A good example is Australia. In 2020, the Australian government leased space in the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve to store part of its own national oil stockpile, around 1.5 million barrels. Physically, this oil stays in American salt caverns. Legally, however, it belongs to Australia. The United States has no right to simply take it and use it to fill its own tankers or anyone else's in a crisis. It's someone else's property, stored under a lease arrangement. Aside from governments, huge volumes of oil also belong to international trading giants like Vitol or Trafigura. They use American storage facilities as transit hubs. Oil can sit in certain storage terminals for months, waiting for a better price in China or India. It may already have been sold under contract with its movement scheduled weeks in advance. An empty tanker at the dock may see that oil sitting in the terminal, but it can't take it because legally it isn't available anymore. It already belongs to a buyer on the other side of the world. This creates the illusion of vast unused reserves. Statistics show millions of tons of oil in storage, and to the average person, it may seem like that oil could easily be used to fill any empty ship. But in fact, the oil market is a complex network of private ownership. Until ownership is transferred to the carrier, the oil will remain in storage, even if the ports are idle and ships are waiting for cargo. You can't simply take someone else's product for the sake of logistical convenience. So in the end, the U.S. has a whole range of quirks and structural issues that can leave the country with plenty of oil while tankers sit empty offshore. But this trend can't be blamed on the U.S. alone. It also has a lot to do with how tanker shipping works and with the economics behind it. In maritime shipping, there's a concept known as a ballast voyage, when a vessel travels empty. At first glance, this sounds absurd. Why send a massive ship across the ocean with no cargo? But the economics of the tanker fleet follow their own logic. Tankers are often contracted for specific routes and specific clients months in advance. If a vessel is supposed to be in a certain place by a certain date, it can't afford to go off course just to pick up some random shipment of oil. The second reason is technical cleanliness. As I mentioned earlier, crude oil comes in different types, from light and fluid to thick and heavy, almost like fuel oil. If a tanker has just carried heavy, dirty crude, its internal tanks may be coated with a layer of sticky residue. So in order to load light, clean American crude afterward, the vessel has to be thoroughly washed. And tank cleaning is an expensive and time-consuming process. It can take up to a week and requires special conditions. For a trader, it's often simpler and cheaper to sail the vessel empty than to spend time and a huge amount of money cleaning the tanks for the sake of one convenient cargo. On top of that, vessel schedules are extremely tight. Waiting to load in an American port, which, as we already know, may be delayed because of shallow waters or some other bottleneck, can jeopardize the next, more profitable contract. So we end up in a strange situation. An empty tanker sails past a port full of oil simply because stopping there doesn't make economic sense. Yes, that's exactly how it works. Everything is dictated by money. In the oil market, one of the key things traders watch is the price difference between two benchmarks, WTI in the United States and Brent in the rest of the world. This difference is called the spread. If American crude is significantly cheaper, it becomes profitable to ship it overseas. The price gap covers transportation, insurance, and all the related costs. But sometimes the situation is different. Sometimes the prices nearly equalize. On top of that, shipping costs may rise. And at some point, the math stops working. The shipment no longer generates profit and instead turns into a loss. When that happens, deals are simply canceled. The oil stays in storage while tankers either wait or sail elsewhere empty. Sometimes a vessel is deliberately kept without cargo while traders wait for prices to change. If oil becomes more profitable to move, then it makes sense to load up and ship it. If not, it's better to wait. The whole situation ends up looking a bit odd. A tanker's built to carry oil, but sometimes it sails without any, simply because that makes more economic sense. In other words, empty tankers off the U.S. coast don't always mean America is short on oil. Sometimes they're the result of perfectly rational business decisions.